Your nickname is Ironhead.
Well, that's Bobby Allison's nickname for me.
This fire suit right here has to be the one that he was burned in the Corvette crash in 2004.
February 18th, 2001. This was the day Dale Earnhardt Senior, the Intimidator, died on the final lap of the Daytona 500. His sudden death left a hole not just in NASCAR, but in American culture. It was an end that felt too abrupt for a man so enduring. In the years that followed, there remained one place untouched by the spotlight: his private garage. Tucked away and mostly unknown to the public, it was a sealed vault of stories, waiting to be opened. Well, they finally did open it, and what they found in Dale Earnhardt's garage after his death shocked everyone. Let's dive straight into it. The public legacy of Dale Earnhardt Senior. Dale Earnhardt Senior's NASCAR career was both long and decorated, marking him as one of the most successful and influential drivers in the sport's history. Between his first Winston Cup victory in 1979 at the Southeastern 500 in Bristol and his final win in 2000 at the Winston 500 in Talladega, he amassed a total of 76 Cup Series victories. But it wasn't just the wins, it was the way he won that defined him. His racing style was unapologetically aggressive, marked by fearless drafting, hard bumping, and a psychological dominance that made him a formidable presence on any track. He claimed 7 Winston Cup championships by winning in 1980, 1986, 1987, 1990, 1991, 1993, and 1994, tying the all-time record held by Richard Petty at the time. This record was later matched by Jimmy Johnson, but never surpassed. Earnhardt was especially dominant at Daytona, winning the Busch Clash 6 times and the Twin 125s a record 12 times, though the Daytona 500 eluded him until 1998, when his emotional victory broke a 20-year drought and was celebrated even by rival pit crews. His influence, however, went far beyond raw numbers. Earnhardt was the archetype of the blue-collar hero, a man who didn't just race for trophies, but raced with an ethos that echoed the struggles and values of everyday Americans. Born in 1951 to Ralph Earnhardt, a respected but underfunded short-track driver, Dale dropped out of school in 9th grade and worked a series of odd jobs to support his early racing efforts. That origin story, coupled with his Southern roots and no-nonsense demeanor, made him a relatable figure, especially among rural and working-class fans. He raced with grit and without apology, a man who made his own way and didn't seek approval. He often wore a scowl beneath his trademark mustache and black sunglasses, and his number 3 black Chevrolet became synonymous with both fear and respect. Earnhardt's public image as the Intimidator was carefully cultivated, but also deeply authentic. His rivals knew him as a relentless competitor who would not hesitate to make contact in the corners, while fans admired him for that very reason. He was blunt, sometimes brash, but always real, an anti-hero for some, a demigod for others. Even those who disliked his methods respected his skill. That authenticity carried over into how he conducted himself off the track. He was known to take time for fans, share hunting and fishing trips with friends, and maintain close ties to his hometown. Unlike many other sports figures of his era, he didn't polish his public image through handlers or media consultants. What fans saw was what they got. But perhaps the most compelling part of Earnhardt's legacy lies in what was left unsaid and unknown, even to those closest to him. After his sudden death during the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, much of the NASCAR world and the general public were stunned not only by the loss itself, but by the quiet empire he had built in the shadows of the spotlight. Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, or DI, the racing organization he founded in Mooresville, North Carolina, had quietly grown into a major force in the sport, fielding cars and developing talent, including his son, Dale Earnhardt Jr. His posthumous influence also extended to safety reforms within the sport. Earnhardt's death, which was caused by a basal skull fracture, became a turning point for NASCAR, which was at the time slow to adopt new safety technologies. In the wake of the tragedy, NASCAR mandated the use of the HANS device, which is short for head and neck support, introduced safer barriers on tracks, redesigned car chassis for impact resistance, and transformed their emergency response protocols. In this sense, his death catalyzed life-saving changes that have since protected countless drivers. Over the years, his presence has been sustained through tributes, documentaries, and the continued popularity of his image. The number 3 car, while retired from active use in the Cup Series for over a decade, returned in 2014 under the leadership of Richard Childress Racing, driven by Childress's grandson, Austin Dillon. His son, Dale Jr., carried the Earnhardt name into the 21st century, becoming a fan favorite in his own right, though never trying to mimic his father's persona or style. To this day, Dale Earnhardt Senior remains a fixture not just in racing circles, but in American popular memory. Murals of his likeness are still painted on garage walls in small towns across the South. His quotes are circulated on social media. The black number 3 continues to be printed on t-shirts, hats, and window decals. His life story, equal parts triumph, struggle, and tragedy, has elevated him from a mere athlete to a cultural icon. But there's more to his story than this. The private garage. When Dale Earnhardt Sr. passed away in 2001, the world lost a motorsports legend, but those closest to him were left with something quietly powerful: a private garage in North Carolina that few had ever truly seen in its entirety. Long known as the Intimidator for his aggressive driving style and unflinching demeanor, Earnhardt maintained a guarded personal life away from the spotlight. So when family members and longtime confidants entered the garage posthumously, it was with a mixture of reverence and hushed curiosity. What they found was not just a storage space for automotive relics. It was a private, curated museum of memory. Located near his property in Mooresville, North Carolina, the garage wasn't flashy or ostentatious. Its layout was functional but meticulous. No neon lights or velvet ropes separated the observer from the items. This wasn't for showmanship. It was intimate. Carefully preserved race cars sat wheel to wheel with helmets and trophies, surrounded by jackets, faded newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and framed photographs, many of which had never been published. Each item seemed to belong not just to a moment, but to a narrative. The effect was less like walking through a warehouse and more like stepping into a silent autobiography told in tools, tires, grease, and grit. Earnhardt had once said, "I left behind everything there." It wasn't just a statement about what he physically left. It was a coded emotional gesture, a last message embedded in the things he chose to keep. At the center of this powerful environment was the crown jewel of his personal archive, a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air. Unlike the polished, spotless Chevys you'd see at car shows, this one had clearly been preserved, not restored. The upholstery was original. The engine bay bore fingerprints and faded labels. The dashboard's chrome trim had the kind of patina that only decades of time can create. For Earnhardt, this was a relic of memory. The car tied back to his childhood in Kannapolis, where his father, Ralph Earnhardt, would wrench on cars in the yard while young Dale watched and learned. Positioned at the geometric center of the garage, the '57 Chevy wasn't just a centerpiece, it was a shrine. Surrounding it were photos of Dale as a boy, sitting on toolboxes, leaning against his father's cars, grinning through grease-stained hands. The placement made it clear. This was where the story began. The rest of the garage served as a moving timeline of his racing life. Parked throughout were several original NASCAR race cars, all kept in the exact condition they were in after their last race. These were the real machines, still bearing the grime, scratches, and race day wear of their final laps. The black number 3 Goodwrench Chevrolet. Monte Carlo, perhaps the most iconic car in NASCAR history, stood solemnly against one wall, its matte black paint absorbing the dim light. Nearby were earlier cars, the blue and yellow Wrangler-sponsored Chevrolet he drove during his rise in the 1980s, and championship-era vehicles from his legendary partnership with Richard Childress. To see these cars preserved, scars and all, was rare. Most drivers don't retain their race cars. Teams often sell or repurpose them. But Earnhardt had held on to these specific machines, evidently understanding that each one marked a milestone that statistics alone could never fully honor. The garage, with all the memorabilia, reflected a side of Earnhardt that even close colleagues never entirely saw while he was alive. A man who preserved his past not for vanity, but for legacy. The stories behind the memorabilia. Dale Earnhardt Senior's garage was not curated in a commercial sense. There were no information plaques or velvet ropes, no glossy displays engineered for visitors. Instead, it was laid out with quiet intentionality, as though Earnhardt was speaking through objects rather than words. Each vehicle, helmet, jacket, and note was placed where he had last left it. At the heart of it all were the cars, and no car told a story more powerfully than the black number 3 Goodwrench Chevrolet Monte Carlo, the very vehicle that had become a symbol of fear and excellence in the 1990s. Several versions of this car were preserved in the garage, each from a different season, bearing scars from their last outings, tire rubs, chipped paint, and grime still clinging to the fenders. These weren't showroom restorations, they were left exactly as they were when Earnhardt climbed out of them. One Monte Carlo still had the cracked rear panel from the 1996 Winston 500, where he pulled off one of his most remarkable victories at Talladega, after coming back from 18th place with just a few laps to go. Another bore subtle traces of dirt from Bristol Motor Speedway, his favorite short track, where he won 9 times during his career. Earlier in the garage sat the Wrangler-sponsored Pontiac Grand Prix from the mid-1980s, a nod to the era before the sleek black number 3 became iconic. This blue and yellow car was from his Richard Childress racing days during the Wrangler years, a period when Earnhardt was still refining his reputation as a hard-charging force. The Wrangler car, while not as famous as the later Goodwrench entries, was a vital link to his early career, especially his 1986 and 1987 championship seasons, which solidified his partnership with Childress and launched what would become NASCAR's most legendary driver-owner pairing. More than just race day vehicles were preserved. Earnhardt's first Busch Series car, a rust-colored, stripped-down Oldsmobile, is also part of the collection. It wasn't fast or famous, but it represented grit and sacrifice. He once told a friend that this was the car he had to pray over before every race, knowing that any crash could be his last, not just because of safety, but because of the financial ruin it would bring. It was with cars like these that he first battled at Concord Speedway and Metrolina Fairgrounds in the late 1970s, when his name was just Ralph's boy trying to make it. One corner of the garage was filled with helmets, arranged roughly by era. The early open-face models with scratched visors were paired with sweat-stained fire suits. These were the tools of a man who started racing when safety gear was minimal and expectations were brutal. His later helmets, complete with more advanced padding and stylized paint jobs, told the story of NASCAR's growing professionalism and his growing stature within it. On one scratched visor from the 1990 Coca-Cola 600, someone had written in silver Sharpie, "Ran it hot, won it anyway." Among the helmets were personal effects that may have seemed mundane but held deep significance, such as a battered leather duffel bag, tagged with faded travel passes from races in Atlanta, Michigan, and Richmond. A paper note scotch-taped to a spare fire suit read, "Spare suit. Use only if desperate." That kind of dry practicality ran through all the items. It was not a man preparing for visitors. It was a man living with full commitment to his craft. Near the back of the garage was a dusty shelf of trophies, some gleaming, others dull with age. There was the classic Harley J. Earl Daytona 500 trophy from 1998, its winged figure unmistakable. But there were also smaller, more modest awards. A plaque from Hickory Motor Speedway, dated 1975, a ceramic mug from a dirt track invitational, a thank you plate from a local school fundraiser where he once donated a signed tire. These lesser-known trophies told stories not found in NASCAR's statistical archives. They spoke to a man who knew where he came from and never lost that grounding, no matter how high he climbed. Then there were the unexpected pieces, his hunting rifle mounted on the wall beside a signed photo of Johnny Rutherford, a camouflage cap with DEI hand-stitched by a fan in 1996, a set of antlers wrapped in duct tape and labeled Talladega 1990 post-race gift from Junior. These were intimate, offbeat items that revealed Earnhardt's humor, his friendships, and his fierce loyalty to his roots and those who supported him. And no story of the memorabilia would be complete without the now legendary 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air. It was not showroom shiny. The paint had dulled, the seats creaked when you leaned in. But this car was different. Positioned in the middle of the garage, it was surrounded by framed photos of a young Dale Earnhardt and his father, Ralph. The Chevy was an origin story in chrome and steel. It was the kind of car Dale had grown up watching his father work on in Kannapolis. It didn't need to win races. It had already won something greater. It preserved the memory of where it all began. For all his intensity, the objects Dale Earnhardt chose to keep were not tributes to power or celebrity. They were fragments of a racing life lived with purpose. Each item, from a scratched visor to a crumpled trophy, was an entry in a life story told not in words but in metal, oil, dirt, and silence. The garage was not a shrine to victory. It was a reflection about why he raced, and for whom. Today, many of these pieces reside at the DEI facility in Mooresville or are on rotation at the Richard Childress Racing Museum in Welcome, North Carolina. Others remain private, preserved as they were, because their value is not for public estimation. But wait, that was not all. Unexpected and quirky items. While much of the garage space was defined by the gravitas of original race cars, championship trophies, and solemn nods to memory and legacy, scattered throughout were unexpected, quirky artifacts that complicated and enriched the picture of who Earnhardt truly was. One of the first oddities that stood out to visitors was a forklift parked near the rear of the garage, not exactly the kind of item one would expect in a space steeped in motorsport history. But this wasn't just any forklift. It was completely decked out in Winston Cup decals, with a small number 3 sticker on the side and remnants of duct tape across the handles. According to former DEI staff members, this forklift had been Earnhardt's favorite way to help out in the shop, especially when heavy parts or crates needed moving. He insisted on driving it himself and often made jokes about it being the real number 3 ride when he wasn't on the track. Covered in faded sponsor logos and clearly still functional, The forklift had become a symbol of Earnhardt's mischievous working-man humor. Not far from it leaned a large, weather-beaten Wrangler billboard, a vintage piece from the early 1980s, back when Earnhardt's number 3 car bore the denim brand's iconic yellow and blue livery. The sign, once used in promotional campaigns across the South, had clearly spent years exposed to wind and sun before Earnhardt salvaged it. Its edges were frayed, the paint chipped, and rust curled across the frame. Yet it had been preserved, deliberately propped upright against the far wall, not for aesthetics, but as a sentimental relic. This billboard represented the first major chapter of his NASCAR career when Wrangler was one of his earliest big sponsors, and the sport was still raw, regional, and unfettered by the polished commercialism that would later define it. Then there were the stranger elements that defied easy categorization. A vintage 1990s soda machine sat humming quietly in the corner, still functional, still stocked with old-school Mountain Dew and Coca-Cola cans bearing the NASCAR logo. There was a time when these machines were ubiquitous in garages and pit lanes across the South, and Earnhardt had kept his. Nearby, a pair of dusty, scuffed-up cowboy boots had been mounted on small wooden stands like trophies of a different sort. The boots had clearly seen years of wear. They weren't labeled, and no plaque identified them, but their placement, up high, oddly reverent, suggested they meant something personal. In the sitting area near the rear exit was a cracked leather recliner that looked like it had survived more than a few decades and more than a few arguments. The seat was worn down in the center, the armrests discolored from years of hands resting there. Beside it, on a small wooden side table, lay an ashtray bearing a number 3 logo, a worn-out TV remote wrapped in electrical tape, and a stack of old racing magazines. There was no attempt to clean this part up. It looked like Earnhardt could have walked in at any moment and slouched back down into that chair to watch a race rerun or a Western movie. It was a lived-in corner, visibly human, imperfect, and entirely uncurated. These objects, though they lacked the weight of championships or historic wins, added a sense of dimensionality to Earnhardt's garage. They offered moments of levity, warmth, and personality amid the machinery and accolades. More than anything, they emphasized that this space was never meant to be a public exhibit. It was a retreat, filled with inside jokes, personal history, and humble relics of a life shaped by more than just the roar of engines and the shine of trophies. What these quirky items made clear, whether it was the Winston Cup forklift or the worn boots, is that Earnhardt never shed his roots. He remained grounded in the world he came from, working class, no nonsense, and dryly funny. He celebrated the high points of his career, yes, but he also honored the mundane, the ridiculous, the sentimental. So, what happened with all of this? The fate of Dale Earnhardt Senior's memorabilia. After Dale Earnhardt Senior died in 2001 at the Daytona 500, much of the racing world stood still in stunned silence. But in the months and years that followed, his family and close associates made a careful, deeply intentional choice, not to polish his memory into something sterile and untouchable, but to preserve the very spaces and artifacts that told the full, nuanced story of the man behind the helmet. Central to this effort was the decision to open parts of Earnhardt's original garage and workshop complex in Mooresville, North Carolina, to the public. Over time, sections of that private realm were carefully transferred to curated settings. The DEI facility in Mooresville, the Richard Childress Racing Museum in Welcome, and the Dale Earnhardt Tribute Center in Kannapolis. The facility, which opened to the public in 1999, included a vast showroom and retail space filled with photos, trophies, race suits, and other memorabilia chronicling the careers of Dale Earnhardt Senior, his son Dale Jr., and other DEI drivers. Visitors would find Earnhardt's Winston Cup trophies, Jr.'s accolades, and tools of the trade presented in an 8,700-square-foot rotunda that felt less like a corporate display and more like a shrine to a life lived fast and fearlessly. The building was affectionately nicknamed the Garage Mahal. Over the years, however, the public-facing side of DEI began to fade. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, the showroom operated on limited hours for just a few hours a day. Visitors during those times described the experience as a nostalgic time capsule, with shelves of memorabilia untouched and largely uncommercialized. But after the pandemic began, the doors never reopened to the public. The vibrant space that once brought fans close to the soul of Earnhardt now remains shuttered, its contents frozen behind locked doors and quieted lights. While parts of the facility are still in use for engineering or private work, the general public has been left out. Those looking for a more immersive encounter with Earnhardt's legacy often find their way to Welcome, North Carolina, where the Richard Childress Racing Museum preserves a massive collection of his race cars and artifacts. The museum, which opened in 2003 inside the original RCR shop, spans nearly 50,000 square feet. The RCR Museum also houses one of Earnhardt's team haulers, signed by fans in the aftermath of his passing in 2001. Visitors often remark on the emotional weight of standing in a room surrounded by these authentic machines and personal touches. The exhibits are carefully arranged, with plaques telling the stories behind each car, race, or photograph. But what resonates most is the energy. The sense that Earnhardt's presence still lingers in the rooms he once walked through. While the RCR Museum is the most extensive and formal preservation of his legacy, there are smaller regional efforts to honor his memory. In his hometown of Kannapolis, North Carolina, tributes to Earnhardt's early life and career can be found at local venues and through rotating exhibitions. The Monroe Paul Center and smaller motorsport museums in the area often include dirt track trophies from his youth and other personal memorabilia that speak to his humble beginnings. These community-centered displays offer a more intimate view of the man before the myth, reminding visitors that before he was the Intimidator, Dale was just a kid from Kannapolis with a dream. Another site that occasionally displays Earnhardt memorabilia is the Curb Museum for Music and Motorsports. Though it isn't solely dedicated to him, its rotating NASCAR exhibits sometimes feature items that once belonged to or celebrated his career. These displays emphasize his connection not just to racing, but to the broader cultural and musical identity of the South. It is in places like these, smaller, more personal, that fans often encounter artifacts that bring back vivid memories of watching him race. However, not all of Earnhardt's memorabilia has found a home in public institutions. Some items, particularly cars and fire suits, have ended up in private collections. Richard Childress, his longtime team owner and close friend, has said that while he managed to preserve over 40 of Earnhardt's original cars, not everything could be kept. In some cases, memorabilia found its way to auction blocks, much to the disappointment of his children and fans. Kelly Earnhardt, Dale's daughter, has spoken publicly about frustrations with access to family memorabilia, noting that many items remain under the control of Teresa Earnhardt and the DEI estate. Stories have circulated about even Dale Jr. being unable to retrieve his own race suits from the DEI facility, pointing to a deeper, more complicated web of legacy management and internal family dynamics. Inside the DEI facility, some rooms reportedly still contain race suits, photographs, and handwritten notes from Dale Senior, stored away and untouched since his passing. While the space remains private and access is restricted, there's a sense among fans and former employees that these artifacts are more than memorabilia. They're pieces of history waiting to be reintroduced to the public. One can only wonder whether Dale Earnhardt, Dale Senior's daughter with Teresa, might one day inherit the estate and choose to share more of it with fans. Until then, much of what remains at DEI stays out of reach. Despite the closures and complications, the power of Dale Earnhardt's legacy has not diminished. Fans from across the country still visit the RCR Museum, describing their experiences as moving, even spiritual. Others make trips to Kannapolis or trace the paths he once walked, piecing together a story that no single exhibit can fully contain. The impact of these spaces extends beyond nostalgia. They reveal how deeply Earnhardt understood the significance of legacy, not just in championships and trophies, but in the emotional imprint he left on his family, team, and fans. Whether it's the pristine black number 3 at RCR, the quietly preserved shop rooms at DEI, or a faded photograph tucked into a local museum in Kannapolis, each piece of memorabilia serves a purpose. It reminds people not only of who Dale Earnhardt was, but of what he stood for. Even the less discussed aspects of his legacy, like the hauler signed by mourning fans or the disputed items locked away from public view, contribute to the emotional richness of his story. They suggest that legacy is not just about preservation, but about tension, memory, and the human impulse to hold on to what matters. As time passes, the significance of these items only grows. What remains of Dale Earnhardt's memorabilia is scattered, some of it carefully curated, some locked away, and some lost to time or private ownership. But all of it carries the weight of a man who gave everything to his sport, his family, and his identity. For longtime fans, seeing Earnhardt's world preserved in this way invites a kind of intimate grief and reflection that few sports museums ever achieve. It's not just a shrine to excellence. It's a deeply honest portrait of a life lived with intensity, humor, and humility. Visitors often describe the experience as emotional and grounding, noting how the rough edges, such as scratches on a car, rust on a tool chest, or a note scrawled in permanent marker, somehow say more than any documentary could. One of the most commented on details is the way the space doesn't glorify just the wins. Among the trophies and accolades are battered car parts from races lost, handwritten letters from fans that were never framed or stylized, and even a broken rear-view mirror Earnhardt had insisted on keeping after a tough race at Martinsville in 1997. On it was taped a short message he'd scribbled to himself: "Still worth it." Ultimately, the preservation of Earnhardt's garage and its satellite displays across North Carolina has created a legacy far richer than racing stats or championship rings. For all his fame and ferocity on the track, Dale Earnhardt left behind a deeply personal human story, told not through polished plaques, but through worn-out boots, bent metal, and handwritten notes. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.